The sound of footsteps echoed through the narrow hallway of the Riverside Apartments as Daniel Park climbed the stairs to the third floor. His toolbox felt heavier than usual today, probably because he had already fixed 2 leaking faucets and a broken window latch before noon. Being the building superintendent meant he was always on call, always moving from one apartment to another, always solving someone else's problems. The old building creaked and groaned with every step he took, and Daniel knew every sound it made. He had lived here for 5 years, ever since he moved to the city with nothing but a suitcase and a dream that had slowly faded into the background of survival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel reached apartment 3F and knocked on Mrs. Chen's door. She had called about a sticky window that wouldn't open, and Daniel was determined to fix it before the afternoon heat became unbearable. Mrs. Chen was a kind woman in her 70s who always offered him tea and homemade cookies. As he worked on the window, she talked about her grandchildren and the weather, and Daniel listened with half his attention while his hands did what they had done 1,000 times before. This was his life now. Fixing things, collecting rent from Mr. Harrison the landlord, making sure the building didn't fall apart. It was honest work, but it wasn't what he had imagined when he first arrived in the city. Daniel had grown up in a small town 3 hours north of here. His parents ran a convenience store that barely made enough to support the family. Money was always tight, and luxuries were non-existent. But Daniel's grandfather had owned an upright piano that sat in the corner of his living room like a forgotten monument. It was old and out of tune, with yellowed keys and a bench that wobbled when you sat on it. But to young Daniel, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. His grandfather had played it occasionally, simple melodies from old songs that Daniel didn't recognize. When his grandfather passed away when Daniel was 10, the piano was sold to pay for the funeral expenses. Daniel remembered the day they took it away, how empty the corner of the living room looked afterward, how something inside him felt hollow and incomplete. That hollow feeling never went away. Throughout middle school and high school, Daniel would stop outside music stores and press his face against the window, staring at the pianos inside. He would watch YouTube videos of pianists performing, their fingers moving across the keys with impossible speed and grace. He downloaded piano apps on his phone and tried to learn simple songs, but it wasn't the same. Nothing could replace the feeling of sitting at a real piano, of pressing down on real keys and hearing actual strings vibrate with sound. After high school, Daniel worked at his parents' store for 2 years, saving every dollar he could. His parents wanted him to take over the business eventually, but Daniel knew that if he stayed in that small town, he would never pursue the thing he loved most. So at 20 years old, he packed his belongings and moved to the city. The plan had been simple. Get a job, save money, take piano lessons, maybe even study music at a community college. But the city was expensive in ways Daniel hadn't anticipated. Rent ate up most of his paycheck from his job at a warehouse. Food and transportation took the rest. Piano lessons were impossibly expensive, sometimes costing as much as his weekly grocery budget for a single hour. The dream of studying music seemed laughable when he could barely afford to eat. After a year of struggling, Daniel found the superintendent position at Riverside Apartments. Mr. Harrison, the landlord, offered free housing in a basement apartment in exchange for maintaining the building and collecting rent. It wasn't glamorous, but it solved Daniel's housing problem and gave him a small salary on top of the free room. The basement apartment was dark and cramped, with a small window near the ceiling that let in only a sliver of natural light. The walls were concrete and always felt damp, and the ceiling pipes groaned and rattled whenever someone upstairs used water. But it was his own space, and Daniel was grateful for it. He set up his tiny apartment with second-hand furniture and a hot plate for cooking. On a milk crate in the corner, he placed his most valuable possession, a small digital keyboard that he had bought used for $50. It had only 61 keys and the sound quality was terrible, but it was better than nothing. Every night after work, Daniel would sit on his creaky bed and practice on that keyboard. He taught himself using free YouTube tutorials and library books about music theory. He started with beginner exercises, simple scales and basic chords that made his fingers ache. Slowly, painfully slowly, he began to improve. The building had 18 apartments spread across 4 floors. Daniel knew every tenant by name, knew their schedules and their habits. On the second floor lived Mrs. Rodriguez, a retired teacher who played her television too loud. Next to her was Mr. Kim, a night shift security guard who Daniel rarely saw. The third floor had young families and college students who were always friendly but rushed. The fourth floor was where the trouble usually came from. That's where the Thompsons lived, a couple who fought loudly every weekend, and where Jake Sullivan, a musician in his 20s, had his apartment. Jake played guitar in a rock band and sometimes practiced late into the night, which drove the other tenants crazy. But the apartment that fascinated Daniel the most was 4B, right next to Jake's place. It had been empty for 3 months, ever since the previous tenant moved out. Daniel had been inside it several times to check on maintenance issues and prepare it for the next renter. What made 4B special was that it was one of the larger units in the building, with high ceilings and beautiful hardwood floors. And in the corner of the living room, covered with a white sheet, sat an upright piano. The previous tenant had left it behind, claiming it was too heavy and expensive to move. Mr. Harrison had grumbled about it, saying he should have it hauled away, but he never got around to actually doing it. So the piano sat there, silent and covered, waiting for someone to play it. Daniel had lifted the sheet once, just to look at it. The piano was old but well maintained, with dark wood that gleamed even under the dust. The keys were ivory, real ivory from decades ago when such things were still legal. Daniel had pressed one key gently, just to hear the sound, and the note that rang out was pure and beautiful, filling the empty apartment with its resonance. He had quickly covered it again and left, his heart pounding with longing. That piano haunted his dreams. He would lie in his basement apartment at night, directly below 4B, and imagine what it would be like to sit at that piano and play. His digital keyboard felt like a toy compared to the real instrument just 2 floors above him. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Harrison had finally rented apartment 4B to a new tenant. Daniel had helped with the move-in, carrying boxes and furniture up the stairs. The new tenant was a woman in her late 20s named Rebecca Walsh. She had moved from another city and worked remotely as some kind of consultant. Daniel wasn't entirely sure. She seemed nice enough, quiet and polite, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and glasses that she was always adjusting. What struck Daniel immediately was that Rebecca barely had any furniture. A bed, a desk, a chair, some boxes of clothes and books. That was it. The apartment looked bare and temporary, like she wasn't planning to stay long or didn't have the money to furnish it properly. On move-in day, Rebecca had noticed the covered piano in the corner. "What's that?" she had asked Daniel. "Just an old piano," Daniel replied, trying to sound casual. "The previous tenant left it. Mr. Harrison hasn't decided what to do with it yet." "Can I use it?" Rebecca asked, her eyes lighting up with interest. Daniel hesitated. "I'd have to ask Mr. Harrison, but he's pretty particular about the building. He might want it removed." Rebecca looked disappointed but nodded. "Well, let me know. I used to play when I was younger." After she said that, Daniel found himself thinking about Rebecca and the piano constantly. Another person who loved music, living right above that beautiful instrument. It seemed cosmically unfair that the piano was right there, accessible, and yet neither of them could touch it. Daniel had worked for Mr. Harrison for 3 years, and in that time, he had come to understand exactly what kind of man his landlord was. Harrison was in his 60s, wealthy from inheriting several properties around the city, and absolutely obsessed with maintaining control over every detail of his buildings. He had rules for everything. No pets, no smoking, no guests staying longer than 3 days, no modifications to the apartments, no noise after 10 p.m., no exceptions ever. Tenants who broke the rules received immediate warnings, and if they broke them again, Harrison would begin eviction proceedings without hesitation. Daniel had watched good people lose their homes over minor infractions because Harrison believed that any leniency would lead to chaos. The landlord visited Riverside Apartments every Tuesday morning to collect rent checks and inspect the building. He would walk through the hallways with a critical eye, looking for any sign of damage or rule violations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He carried a small notebook where he wrote down every tiny issue, from a scuff mark on the wall to a bicycle left in the hallway. Daniel dreaded Tuesday mornings because Harrison always found something to criticize about his maintenance work. "The faucet in 2C is still dripping," Harrison would say. "The front door needs another coat of paint. Why are there leaves on the front steps?" It didn't matter that Daniel worked constantly to keep the building in good shape. Harrison always wanted more. 2 weeks after Rebecca moved in, Daniel was fixing a loose banister on the second-floor staircase when he heard something that made him stop mid-turn of his screwdriver. Music. Piano music, faint but unmistakable, drifting down from the upper floors. Daniel's heart started beating faster. Someone was playing the piano in 4B. It had to be Rebecca. The music was hesitant and unpracticed, with long pauses between phrases as if the player was remembering how to navigate the keys. But even with the mistakes and uncertainties, the melody was beautiful. Daniel recognized it as something classical, though he couldn't name the piece. He sat on the stairs and listened, his tools forgotten, completely absorbed in the sound. The music continued for about 15 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Daniel heard footsteps above him, then silence. He wanted desperately to go upstairs and talk to Rebecca about the piano, to ask her about the piece she was playing, to share his own love of music with someone who might understand. But he forced himself to return to his work. It wasn't his business what Rebecca did in her apartment, as long as she paid rent and followed the rules. Except she wasn't exactly following the rules. Harrison had never explicitly given permission for anyone to use the piano. In fact, Daniel was fairly certain that if Harrison knew someone was playing it, he would have it removed immediately just to eliminate any potential issues. Over the next week, Daniel heard Rebecca playing several more times. Always in the afternoon, always for short periods, as if she was sneaking practice sessions when she thought no one would notice. Her playing improved noticeably, becoming more confident and fluid. Daniel found himself timing his maintenance work to be near the stairwell during the afternoon, just so he could listen. The other tenants noticed too. Mrs. Chen mentioned it when Daniel came to fix her bathroom sink. "Someone's playing piano upstairs," she said with a smile. "It's lovely. Reminds me of when I was a girl." Even Jake Sullivan, the guitarist from 4A, commented on it. "Hey Daniel," Jake said one afternoon. "Do you know who's playing that piano?" "My neighbor, I think," Daniel replied carefully. "Why, is it bothering you?" "Bothering me," Jake laughed. "Are you kidding? It's the best thing I've heard in this building. Whoever it is has real talent." But not everyone was pleased. The Thompsons from 4D complained that the piano playing disturbed their afternoon naps. Mr. Kim, the night shift security guard, mentioned that he could hear it faintly in his apartment and it woke him up since he slept during the day. Daniel tried to deflect these complaints, suggesting that the playing was quiet and infrequent, that it was no different from someone playing a radio or television. But he knew that if enough tenants complained, or if Harrison found out, there would be trouble. The situation came to a head on a Tuesday morning exactly 3 weeks after Rebecca moved in. Daniel was in the lobby, mopping the floor before Harrison's weekly visit, when he heard it again. Piano music from upstairs, clearer and louder than usual. Rebecca must have opened her apartment windows to let in the spring breeze, and the sound was carrying through the entire building. Daniel's stomach dropped. Harrison would be arriving any minute, and there was no way he wouldn't hear the music. Daniel considered running upstairs to warn Rebecca, but before he could move, the front door opened and Harrison walked in, briefcase in hand and his usual scowl on his face. The landlord stopped just inside the door, his head tilted slightly as he registered the piano music floating down from above. "What is that?" Harrison demanded. Daniel's mind raced. "It's just a tenant playing some music, nothing serious." "Playing music," Harrison's scowl deepened. "What tenant? Which apartment?" Before Daniel could answer, Harrison was already moving toward the stairs. Daniel hurried to follow him, his heart pounding with dread. The landlord climbed the stairs quickly for a man his age, his expensive shoes clicking sharply against each step. The piano music grew louder as they ascended. When they reached the 4th floor, Harrison stopped outside apartment 4B. The music was clearly coming from inside, a gentle melody that sounded like a lullaby or a hymn. Harrison raised his fist and pounded on the door with enough force to make the frame rattle. The music stopped immediately. There was a moment of silence, then footsteps approaching the door. Rebecca opened it, looking confused and slightly alarmed at the aggressive knocking. "Yes," she said. "Can I help you?" "I'm Richard Harrison, the landlord of this building," Harrison said, his voice cold and formal. "And you are playing my piano without permission." Rebecca's face went pale. "I didn't realize I needed permission. The piano was already here when I moved in, and I thought." "You thought wrong," Harrison interrupted. "That piano is my property, and you have no right to touch it. I could have you charged with property damage." Daniel stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Mr. Harrison, there's no damage. Rebecca was just playing some music. It's not causing any problems." "Stay out of this, Daniel," Harrison snapped without looking at him. Then turning back to Rebecca, he continued. "I have rules in this building for a reason. Tenants do not use property that doesn't belong to them. If you touch that piano again, I will call the police. Do you understand?" Rebecca's eyes widened with shock and hurt. "Yes, I understand," she said quietly. "Good," Harrison said. "I'll be having that piano removed by the end of the week. It's caused nothing but trouble." He turned and walked back toward the stairs, leaving Daniel and Rebecca standing in the doorway. Daniel looked at Rebecca's face and saw tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I'm sorry," Daniel said quietly. "I should have warned you that he's particular about the building rules." Rebecca wiped at her eyes quickly, trying to compose herself. "It's not your fault. I should have asked permission first." She started to close the door, but Daniel spoke up quickly. "Wait. Why is playing piano so important to you?" Rebecca paused, the door half closed. She looked at Daniel for a long moment, as if deciding whether to trust him with an honest answer. "Because," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "it's the only thing that helps me forget, even for a few minutes." "Forget what?" Daniel asked gently. "Everything I lost," Rebecca replied. Then she closed the door softly, leaving Daniel standing alone in the hallway. He heard her footsteps moving away from the door, then silence. No crying, no movement, just silence that somehow felt heavier than any sound. Daniel stood there for several minutes, processing what had just happened and what Rebecca had said. "Everything I lost." Those 3 words carried a weight of pain that Daniel recognized because he carried his own version of it. The dreams given up, the sacrifices made, the constant compromise between what you wanted and what survival required. He had seen it in Rebecca's face, that look of someone barely holding herself together, using music as the only anchor keeping her from drifting away completely. Daniel walked slowly back downstairs, his mind churning with thoughts. He found Harrison in the lobby, making notes in his ever-present notebook. The landlord looked up as Daniel approached. "I want that piano gone by Friday," Harrison said without preamble. "Call a removal service. I don't care what it costs, I'll deduct it from your salary if necessary. That piano has been nothing but a liability since it was left here." "Mr. Harrison," Daniel began carefully, "maybe we could reconsider." The music wasn't bothering anyone. In fact, several tenants said they enjoyed hearing it. "I don't care if they enjoyed it," Harrison snapped. "Rules are rules, Daniel. The moment you start making exceptions, people take advantage. Next thing you know, everyone thinks they can do whatever they want. That piano goes, and that's final." The landlord gathered his briefcase and headed for the door. "And tell Miss Walsh that if I hear one more note from that piano before it's removed, I'll begin eviction proceedings immediately." With that, Harrison left, the door closing behind him with a definitive bang that echoed through the lobby. Daniel spent the rest of that day in a fog of anger and helplessness. He went through his maintenance duties mechanically, fixing a clogged drain here, replacing a light bulb there, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about Rebecca's face when Harrison threatened to call the police, about the tears she had tried to hide, about her words, "It's the only thing that helps me forget everything I lost." That evening, Daniel sat in his basement apartment with his cheap digital keyboard on his lap. He tried to practice, but the sounds it produced felt hollow and fake, a poor imitation of real music. He thought about the piano upstairs, about its rich tone and responsive keys, about how it would be gone in 3 days, probably sold for scrap or hauled to a dump somewhere. The injustice of it burned in his chest. Here was a beautiful instrument that could bring joy and healing to someone who desperately needed it, and Harrison was going to destroy it simply because he could, because he valued control over compassion. Daniel had never been a rebellious person. He followed rules, did what he was told, kept his head down and worked hard. But something about this situation felt different. Something about Rebecca's pain and Harrison's cruelty ignited a spark of defiance in him that he didn't know existed. He thought about his grandfather's piano, the one that had been sold to pay bills when Daniel was 10. He remembered watching the moving truck drive away with it, remembered feeling powerless and small, unable to stop something precious from being taken away. He had been powerless then. But maybe he didn't have to be powerless now. The next morning, Daniel knocked on apartment 4B before he could talk himself out of it. Rebecca answered the door, looking tired and guarded. Her apartment was even barer than before, as if she had started packing to leave. "Hi," Daniel said. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" "About what?" Rebecca asked. "About the piano," Daniel replied. "And about why it matters so much to you." Rebecca hesitated, then stepped back to let him inside. The apartment was dim with the curtains drawn, giving it a cave-like quality. The covered piano sat in the corner like a ghost. They sat on the floor since Rebecca didn't have a couch, leaning against the wall. "I need to understand something," Daniel said. "You told Harrison that the piano helps you forget." "Forget what?" Rebecca was quiet for so long that Daniel thought she might not answer. Then she started talking, her voice soft and distant, as if she was recounting someone else's story rather than her own. 2 years ago, she said, I was engaged to be married. His name was Thomas. We had been together since college, and he was everything I thought I wanted. Kind, stable, supportive. We had bought a house together, a small place with a backyard where we planned to have kids someday. I had a good job as a marketing director. Everything was perfect, or at least I thought it was. She paused, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. Then one day, Thomas sat me down and told me he had been having an affair with a coworker for 8 months. 8 months, and I never suspected anything. He said he was in love with her, that he wanted a divorce, that he was sorry but he couldn't pretend anymore. Daniel listened without interrupting, sensing that Rebecca needed to tell this story without being stopped. Everything fell apart so fast, she continued. The house was in both our names, but I couldn't afford the mortgage on my own, so we had to sell it. Thomas married the other woman 3 months after our divorce was finalized. I threw myself into work, trying to prove that I was fine, that I didn't need him, that I was strong enough to handle it. But I wasn't handling it. I was falling apart inside, having panic attacks at my desk, not sleeping, barely eating. My work performance suffered, and eventually, I was let go. Not fired exactly, but encouraged to resign. Rebecca's voice cracked slightly, but she kept going. I lost my job, my home, my relationship, my entire life plan, all within a year. I moved back in with my parents for a while, but that was its own kind of torture. My mother kept asking when I was going to get back out there, when I was going to move on, when I was going to be okay again. She meant well, but I felt like I was drowning and everyone kept telling me to just swim harder. So I moved here, to a city where nobody knows me, where I could start over. But starting over turns out to be harder than I expected. I can't afford therapy. I can barely afford this apartment. Most days I feel like I'm just going through the motions, pretending to be a functional human being." She looked up at Daniel, her eyes red but no longer crying. "Then I found that piano. I used to play when I was a kid, took lessons for 6 years before I quit to focus on school. I hadn't touched a piano in over a decade. But when I sat down at that instrument and started playing, something shifted inside me. For those few minutes, I wasn't the woman who got cheated on and divorced. I wasn't the failure who lost her career. I was just someone making music. It was the first time in 2 years that I felt like myself again." She laughed bitterly. "And now even that's being taken away. I should be used to losing things by now." Daniel felt a surge of emotion in his chest, a mixture of anger at Harrison and empathy for Rebecca that was so strong it almost hurt. "I understand more than you might think," he said quietly. Rebecca looked at him questioningly, and Daniel found himself telling his own story. About his grandfather's piano, about moving to the city with dreams of studying music, about the reality of expensive rent and poverty that made those dreams impossible, about his nightly practice sessions on a keyboard that cost less than a week's groceries. "I'm 31 years old," Daniel said, "and I've never taken a single formal piano lesson. I've never performed for anyone. I live in a basement and fix broken toilets for a living. But when I play piano, even on my terrible keyboard, I feel like I'm doing what I was meant to do. Like I'm connected to something bigger than my small, disappointing life." They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers who had just shared their deepest disappointments with each other. Then Rebecca spoke. "So what do we do? Harrison is having the piano removed in 2 days. There's nothing we can do." "Maybe there is," Daniel said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. It was risky, probably stupid, definitely against the rules. But sometimes rules needed to be broken. "What are you thinking?" Rebecca asked, sensing his shift in energy. "I'm thinking," Daniel said, "that we have 48 hours before that piano disappears forever. And I'm thinking that Harrison only comes to the building on Tuesday mornings. And I'm thinking that if we're going to lose the piano anyway, we might as well use it while we still can." Rebecca's eyes widened. "You want us to play it? After Harrison explicitly forbade it? If he finds out, he'll evict me and probably fire you." "I know," Daniel admitted. "But he won't find out if we're careful. We keep the windows closed so the sound doesn't carry. We only play when Harrison isn't here. We have 2 days, Rebecca. 2 days to play a real piano before it's gone forever." Rebecca looked at the covered piano in the corner, then back at Daniel. She was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risk against the opportunity. Then slowly, a small smile appeared on her face, the first genuine smile Daniel had seen from her. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it. But you have to play too. This isn't just my piano for the next 2 days. It's ours." That evening, after Daniel finished his maintenance rounds and confirmed that Harrison had left for the day, he returned to apartment 4B with his heart pounding with nervous excitement. Rebecca had closed all the windows and drawn the curtains, creating a contained space where sound wouldn't escape as easily. Together, they removed the white sheet from the piano, revealing its full beauty. The wood gleamed in the lamplight, dark and rich like expensive chocolate. The ivory keys seemed to glow with their own inner light. Daniel ran his hand along the smooth surface, feeling the quality of craftsmanship that had gone into building this instrument decades ago. Rebecca sat down at the bench first, her hands hovering over the keys for a moment before pressing down. The sound that filled the apartment was everything Daniel had imagined and more. Rich, warm, resonant notes that seemed to vibrate in his chest. Rebecca began to play a piece that Daniel didn't recognize, something classical with a melancholy melody that matched the mood of their situation. Her technique was rusty, and she stumbled over some of the more complex passages, but the emotion in her playing was undeniable. Daniel stood behind her, watching her fingers move across the keys, completely mesmerized. This was what real piano playing looked like, what it sounded like, what it felt like to be in the presence of live music being created in real time. When Rebecca finished, she turned to Daniel with flushed cheeks and bright eyes. "Your turn," she said, standing up from the bench. Daniel's hands were shaking as he sat down. He had dreamed of playing a real piano for so long, and now that the moment had arrived, he was terrified that he would disappoint himself, that years of practice on a cheap keyboard wouldn't translate to the real thing. He placed his hands on the keys, feeling their weight and texture, so different from the plastic keys he was used to. He started with something simple, a piece by Bach that he had practiced hundreds of times. The moment his fingers pressed down and the sound emerged, Daniel felt tears spring to his eyes. This was what music was supposed to sound like. The piano responded to every tiny adjustment in pressure, every subtle change in timing. When he played softly, the notes were like whispered secrets. When he played with strength, the sound filled the entire room with power. The dynamic range was unlike anything his keyboard could produce. Daniel played the Bach piece all the way through, then immediately started another one, unable to stop himself. Rebecca sat on the floor near the piano, listening with her eyes closed and a peaceful expression on her face. They took turns playing for over 2 hours that night, passing the bench back and forth like children sharing a beloved toy. Rebecca played pieces from her childhood lessons, fumbling through half-remembered melodies with endearing determination. Daniel played everything he had ever learned, from simple beginner exercises to more complex pieces he had painstakingly taught himself. They laughed when they made mistakes, encouraged each other through difficult passages, and sat in appreciative silence when one of them played something particularly beautiful. For those hours, the outside world disappeared. There was no cruel landlord, no broken dreams, no painful past. There was only the music and the joy of creating it together. The next morning arrived too quickly for Daniel's liking. He had stayed in Rebecca's apartment until nearly midnight, both of them reluctant to end their impromptu concert. When he finally returned to his basement room, his fingers still tingled with the memory of the piano keys beneath them. He had barely slept, his mind replaying every note, every moment of connection with an instrument that felt like coming home after years of wandering. But morning brought reality back with harsh clarity. Today was Wednesday, which meant he had exactly 48 hours before the piano removal company would arrive on Friday afternoon. Daniel went through his morning routine in a daze, his body performing familiar tasks while his mind remained upstairs with the piano. He fixed a dripping showerhead in apartment 1A, replaced a broken doorknob in 2F, and cleared a clogged kitchen sink in 3C. Mrs. Chen caught him in the hallway as he was leaving her neighbor's apartment and offered him fresh muffins she had baked that morning. "You look tired, dear," she said with concern. "Are you feeling well?" "Just didn't sleep much," Daniel admitted, accepting a muffin wrapped in a napkin. Mrs. Chen patted his arm. "You work too hard. You should take better care of yourself. A young man like you needs proper rest." As Daniel continued his rounds, he became increasingly aware of the building's sounds. Every creak of floorboards, every slam of a door, every voice in the hallway made him tense with worry that Harrison had returned unexpectedly. The landlord almost never came on days other than Tuesday, but almost never wasn't the same as never. Daniel found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, checking the lobby entrance, listening for the distinctive sound of Harrison's expensive leather shoes on the tile floor. The paranoia was exhausting, but necessary. If Harrison caught them using the piano now, after his explicit threat, the consequences would be severe. Around noon, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca. "Can you come up when you have a chance? Need to talk about something." Daniel felt his stomach clench with worry. Had she changed her mind about their plan? Had someone complained about hearing the piano last night? He quickly finished the repair he was working on and headed up to the 4th floor. Rebecca answered his knock immediately, as if she had been waiting by the door. "Come in," she said quietly, glancing down the hallway to make sure no one saw them together. Inside her apartment, Rebecca had transformed the space around the piano. She had moved her small desk closer to create a makeshift music stand area, and she had printed out several pages of sheet music that now sat in neat stacks on the floor. "I've been thinking," she said as Daniel closed the door behind him. "If we only have 2 days with this piano, I want to make them count. I want to actually learn something new, push myself beyond the simple pieces I remember from childhood." She gestured to the printed sheet music. I found some intermediate pieces online this morning. I was hoping maybe we could work on them together, teach each other. Daniel picked up one of the printed pages and recognized it as a Chopin nocturne, one of the easier ones but still challenging for someone at their skill level. This is ambitious, he said. We might not be able to master it in 2 days. I don't need to master it, Rebecca replied. I just want to try. I want to feel like I'm growing, like I'm moving forward instead of staying stuck. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense to Daniel. He had spent years practicing the same comfortable pieces on his keyboard, never pushing himself because failure felt too risky when you were teaching yourself. But Rebecca was right. If they only had 2 days, they should challenge themselves, reach for something beyond their current abilities. They spent the afternoon working through the Chopin nocturne together, taking turns at the piano and discussing fingering choices, tempo decisions, and interpretation ideas. Neither of them had formal training in music theory, but they both had instincts developed through years of listening and loving music. Rebecca would play a phrase and ask Daniel what he thought, and he would offer suggestions based on recordings he had heard or techniques he had read about online. Then Daniel would try the same phrase, and Rebecca would point out things she noticed, small details about dynamics or phrasing that could make the music more expressive. The process was slow and frustrating at times. They made countless mistakes, had to stop and restart frequently, and occasionally disagreed about how a particular section should sound. But there was also something deeply satisfying about the collaborative effort. Daniel had always practiced alone in his basement, with no one to share his progress or setbacks. Having Rebecca as a partner made the work feel less isolating, more purposeful. Around 3 o'clock, they took a break and sat on the floor with cups of instant coffee that Rebecca heated in her electric kettle. I used to think I wanted to be a concert pianist when I was a kid, Rebecca said, staring into her coffee. My teacher said I had talent, that I could probably get into a music conservatory if I worked hard enough. But my parents were practical people. They said music was a nice hobby but not a realistic career. They wanted me to study business or medicine, something stable. So you gave it up, Daniel said. Rebecca nodded. By the time I was 16, I had stopped taking lessons entirely. I told myself it was because I was too busy with schoolwork and college applications, but really I think I was just tired of fighting for something that everyone said was impractical. And then years passed, and suddenly I was doing exactly what my parents wanted. Good job, nice house, respectable fiancé. Everything looked perfect from the outside. She laughed bitterly. Look how that turned out. At least you tried to pursue music when you moved here, Daniel offered. That takes courage. I tried and failed, Rebecca corrected. I couldn't even afford a single piano lesson. What kind of pursuit is that? Daniel set down his coffee cup and looked at Rebecca seriously. You didn't fail. You're still here, still loving music, still wanting to play despite everything that's happened. That's not failure. That's persistence. Rebecca met his eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. A recognition of shared struggle, of kindred spirits who refused to let circumstances completely extinguish their passion. Thank you, Rebecca said softly. For understanding. For being here. For sharing the piano with me. Daniel felt his face grow warm. We should probably get back to practicing. We're burning daylight. They worked for another 3 hours, until the sun began to set outside Rebecca's windows and the room grew dim. Daniel showed Rebecca some exercises he had learned for building finger strength and dexterity, while Rebecca shared insights about pedaling technique that she remembered from her childhood lessons. They laughed when Daniel's fingers tangled during a particularly fast passage, and Rebecca applauded when he finally played it correctly after a dozen attempts. By the time Daniel left that evening, both of them had made noticeable progress on the Chopin piece. It was far from performance-ready, but it was better than either of them could have played alone. That night in his basement apartment, Daniel couldn't settle his restless energy. His hands kept moving through the motions of playing piano even when there was no instrument in front of him. He kept hearing the sound of the upright piano in his mind, the rich resonance that his keyboard could never reproduce. He thought about Rebecca's words, about her childhood dream of being a concert pianist, about how practical concerns had steered her away from music just like they had steered him away. How many people were out there living practical lives while their true passions withered from neglect? How many potential artists and musicians and creators were working jobs they hated because following their dreams seemed too risky or too expensive? Thursday morning brought a new complication. Daniel was in the lobby organizing his maintenance schedule for the day when Jake Sullivan, the guitarist from apartment 4A, came down the stairs with his guitar case. "Hey Daniel," Jake called out. "Got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" Daniel replied, trying to sound casual. Jake set down his guitar case and lowered his voice. "Look, I don't want to cause problems, but I've been hearing piano music coming from Rebecca's apartment the last couple of nights. I know Harrison banned her from using it, so I'm guessing you guys are sneaking practice time." Daniel felt his stomach drop. How many other tenants had noticed? Was word spreading through the building? Before he could figure out how to respond, Jake continued. "I'm not going to say anything to Harrison, don't worry. I'm a musician. I understand the need to play. But you should know that the Thompsons have been complaining to each other about it in the hallway. They're the type who might call Harrison directly if they get annoyed enough." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, stress building in his chest. "We've been keeping the windows closed, playing quietly. I didn't think anyone could hear it that clearly." "Sound travels in old buildings," Jake said. "Especially piano sound. Those low frequencies travel through walls and floors pretty easily." "What should we do?" Daniel asked. Stop playing entirely seemed impossible now, not when they only had one day left. Jake thought for a moment. The Thompsons usually go out Thursday evenings for their weekly date night. They leave around 6 and don't come back until 10 or later. If you're going to practice tonight, that would be your safest window. No pun intended. Daniel felt a rush of gratitude. "Thanks, Jake. Really, I appreciate you looking out for us." Jake picked up his guitar case. "Like I said, musicians stick together. Besides, Rebecca's actually got some serious skill. I've been enjoying the free concerts." He headed toward the door, then paused and looked back. "You know, there's an open mic night at a cafe downtown every Friday. Local musicians, amateur stuff mostly. You two should consider playing there sometime. You're both good enough." The suggestion caught Daniel off guard. Performing in public had never occurred to him as a real possibility. "That's something to think about," Daniel said noncommittally. Jake grinned. "Life's too short to keep all your music locked away in your apartment, man. Think about it." After Jake left, Daniel stood in the lobby processing this new information. The Thompsons were complaining, which meant time was running out faster than he had anticipated. But Jake's suggestion about the open mic night had planted a seed in his mind. What if they could perform together, just once, before the piano disappeared? Not in Rebecca's apartment where they had to whisper and hide, but in a real venue where people came specifically to listen to music. Daniel found himself climbing the stairs to 4B before he had fully decided what he wanted to say. He knocked on Rebecca's door and she answered in sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. "Everything okay?" she asked, seeing the expression on his face. "Can I come in?" Daniel asked. "I have an idea." Inside, Rebecca listened as Daniel explained about Jake's warning and his suggestion about the open mic night. She sat on the floor with her knees pulled up to her chest, absorbing the information. "So we might not even have until tomorrow," she said quietly. "The Thompsons could call Harrison any time." "Possibly," Daniel admitted. "But Jake said they go out tonight from 6 to 10. That gives us 4 hours of safe practice time. And I was thinking, what if we work towards something specific? What if we prepared a duet, something we could play together, and performed it at that open mic tomorrow night?" Rebecca looked up sharply. "You want to perform in public? In front of strangers?" "Just once," Daniel said. "One performance before the piano is gone." Something to work toward, something that makes these 2 days mean more than just sneaking around behind Harrison's back. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring at the covered piano. "I haven't performed in front of anyone since my recital when I was 15, she finally said. "I'm not sure I remember how." "Neither have I," Daniel admitted. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe we need to do something that scares us, that pushes us beyond our comfort zone. If we're going to lose the piano anyway, shouldn't we at least try to do something meaningful with the time we have left?" Rebecca stood up and walked over to the piano, running her hand along its covered surface. "What kind of duet?" she asked. There was a note of interest in her voice now, cautious but growing. Daniel had already been thinking about this. "Something simple enough that we can learn it in one day, but beautiful enough that it's worth performing. Maybe one of the easier Mozart duets, or something from the folk song repertoire." Rebecca pulled out her phone and started searching. After a few minutes of browsing and listening to samples, she found a piece that made her pause. "What about this?" she said, turning her phone so Daniel could hear. It was a four-hand arrangement of a traditional Irish melody, slow and haunting, with interweaving parts that created a rich harmonic texture. "It's beautiful," Daniel said. "Do you think we can learn it in time?" "Only one way to find out," Rebecca replied. She was already pulling up the sheet music on her laptop to print it out. Something had shifted in her demeanor. The defeated sadness that had characterized her since Harrison's confrontation was gone, replaced by determined focus. They spent the rest of Thursday afternoon preparing for their evening practice session. Rebecca printed out the duet music and studied the parts, marking fingerings and potential trouble spots. Daniel completed his essential maintenance tasks as quickly as possible, wanting to free up his entire evening for practice. He kept checking his watch, counting down the hours until 6 o'clock when the Thompsons would leave and their window of safe practice time would open. At 5:45, Daniel positioned himself in the lobby where he could watch for the Thompsons to leave. Right on schedule, they emerged from the stairwell dressed for their evening out. Mr. Thompson wore a sport coat and his wife had on a dress and heels. They barely acknowledged Daniel as they passed through the lobby and out the front door. Daniel waited 5 minutes to make sure they were really gone, then texted Rebecca. "Coast is clear. See you in 5. When Daniel arrived at apartment 4B, Rebecca had already uncovered the piano and set up the sheet music. She had arranged 2 desk lamps near the piano to provide better lighting, creating a small pool of illumination in the otherwise dim apartment. "Ready to work?" she asked. "Ready," Daniel confirmed. They started by reading through the piece separately, each playing their own part to get familiar with the notes and rhythms. The music was moderately difficult, requiring good coordination and careful attention to dynamics. The 2 parts wove together in ways that sometimes created consonant harmony and sometimes created interesting dissonances that resolved satisfyingly. After they both felt comfortable with their individual parts, they attempted to play together for the first time. Rebecca sat on the left side of the bench handling the lower part, while Daniel sat on the right playing the higher melodic line. The first attempt was a disaster. They started at different tempos, crashed into each other during a hand-crossing section, and completely lost synchronization by the end of the first page. "This is harder than I thought," Rebecca said, laughing despite the frustration. "We need to figure out how to stay together." They tried again, this time counting out loud to keep their tempo matched. This worked better, though they still had moments of confusion where one person would rush ahead or lag behind. The physical proximity of sitting side by side on the piano bench was also awkward at first. Their shoulders bumped, their arms occasionally collided, and they had to navigate the sharing of the middle section of the keyboard where their parts overlapped. But gradually, after multiple attempts, they began to find their rhythm together. Daniel learned to listen for Rebecca's bass line and let it anchor his melody. Rebecca discovered she could sense when Daniel was about to play a phrase and adjust her timing to match his. The music began to coalesce into something cohesive, the 2 separate parts merging into a unified whole that was greater than either part alone. By 7:30, they could play through the entire piece without major mistakes. It wasn't perfect, there were still passages where they weren't quite together, places where the dynamics could be more refined, moments where fingers stumbled over difficult passages. But the overall shape of the music was there, the emotional arc from the gentle opening through the more intense middle section to the peaceful conclusion. "Let's take a break," Daniel suggested after they had played through the piece 3 times in a row. "My hands are getting tired." They sat on the floor and shared a bag of pretzels that Rebecca had in her mostly empty pantry. "I can't believe we learned that in a few hours," Rebecca said. "It usually took me weeks to learn a new piece when I was taking lessons." "I think it helps having a specific goal," Daniel replied. "Knowing we're going to perform tomorrow makes every practice session feel urgent." Rebecca nodded, then looked at Daniel with a more serious expression. "Are you nervous about performing tomorrow?" "Terrified," Daniel admitted. "But also excited. More excited than nervous, maybe." "Same," Rebecca said. "I keep thinking about all the things that could go wrong. We could forget the music, or get out of sync, or just sound terrible in front of everyone. Or," Daniel countered, "we could sound exactly as good as we do right now. Which is actually pretty good. And even if we make mistakes, at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have done something brave." Rebecca smiled. "When did you become the optimistic one?" "I'm usually the one who has to talk myself into taking risks." "Maybe I'm inspired by you," Daniel said. "You've lost so much but you're still here, still trying to find joy in music. That takes real strength." Rebecca looked away, but Daniel could see she was moved by his words. "We should get back to practicing," she said softly. "We still have a couple hours before the Thompsons come home." They returned to the piano and continued refining the duet. This time they focused on the interpretive aspects rather than just getting the notes right. They experimented with different tempos, finding the pace that felt most natural. They adjusted dynamics to create more contrast between loud and soft sections. They worked on making the transitions between sections smooth and logical. Daniel found himself becoming increasingly aware of Rebecca's presence beside him on the bench. The way she leaned into the piano when she played with intensity, the slight furrow in her brow when she concentrated on a difficult passage, the pleased smile that appeared when they nailed a tricky section together. There was an intimacy to playing duet piano that surprised him, a kind of nonverbal communication that happened through shared breath and synchronized movement. By 9:30, they were both exhausted but satisfied with their progress. The duet wasn't flawless, but it was genuinely musical. It had shape and emotion and moments of real beauty. If they could replicate this level of performance tomorrow night at the open mic, Daniel felt confident they wouldn't embarrass themselves. "I should probably head back downstairs," Daniel said reluctantly. "The Thompsons will be home soon." Rebecca nodded but didn't move from the piano bench. "Thank you," she said. "For tonight, for this whole crazy plan, for giving me something to look forward to instead of just dreading." Daniel felt a warmth spread through his chest. "I should be thanking you. This has been one of the best weeks of my life, even with all the stress and sneaking around." They looked at each other for a moment, and Daniel had the strange sensation that something significant was happening, something beyond just two people sharing a piano. Before he could analyze the feeling too closely, he stood up and headed for the door. "See you tomorrow," he said. "Big day ahead." "Sleep well," Rebecca replied. "And Daniel?" He turned back. "Yes? I'm glad Harrison yelled at me that day. If he hadn't, we never would have started talking. We never would have done any of this." Daniel smiled. "Me too. Good night, Rebecca." Back in his basement apartment, Daniel lay in his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. His fingers absently moved through the motions of playing the duet, muscle memory rehearsing the piece even without a piano present. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow the piano removal company would arrive in the afternoon. Tomorrow night they would perform their duet at the open mic. And then it would be over. The piano would be gone, and Daniel would return to his normal life of fixing leaky faucets and unclogging drains. But something had fundamentally changed over the past few days. Daniel had tasted what it felt like to pursue music seriously, to work toward a performance, to collaborate with another musician. He had experienced the joy of playing a real piano, of hearing his music resonate in a proper acoustic space. He had connected with someone who understood his passion and shared his struggles. Whatever happened tomorrow, whether they performed well or poorly, whether Harrison found out about their secret practice sessions or remained ignorant, Daniel knew he couldn't go back to his old existence. The hollow feeling that had lived inside him since his grandfather's piano was sold had been temporarily filled, and now that he knew what fullness felt like, he couldn't accept emptiness again. These thoughts swirled through his mind as he finally drifted into restless sleep, dreaming of piano keys and sheet music and the sound of two people making music together in defiance of a world that told them they didn't belong. Friday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Daniel woke early as always, went through his usual routine of showering and dressing, and began his maintenance rounds. But everything felt different, charged with significance. This was the last day. The last day the piano would exist in apartment 4B. The last day Daniel would have access to a real instrument. The last day before everything changed again. He moved through the building in a haze, his mind already jumping ahead to the evening's performance. What should he wear? Should they introduce themselves to the audience or just play? What if they forgot the music in the middle of the piece? What if nobody applauded? What if everyone laughed? Around 10 in the morning, Daniel's phone rang. The caller ID showed it was the piano removal company. "Hello, this is Daniel Park," he answered, his heart sinking. "Hi, this is Sam from Premier Piano Movers," a cheerful voice said. "Just calling to confirm our appointment at Riverside Apartments today at 2 p.m. We'll be removing an upright piano from apartment 4B. "That's correct," Daniel said, his voice flat. "Great. We'll see you this afternoon." The call ended, and Daniel stood in the hallway staring at his phone. 2 o'clock. That gave them less than 4 hours. He immediately texted Rebecca. "Piano movers coming at 2 p.m. We should play one last time before they arrive." Her response came quickly. "I'll be waiting." Daniel rushed through his remaining maintenance tasks with unusual speed, not caring about his usual attention to detail. A slightly crooked picture frame could stay slightly crooked. A squeaky door hinge could squeak for one more day. Nothing mattered except getting to that piano and playing it one final time. By 11:30, he was knocking on Rebecca's door. She answered immediately, dressed in jeans and a faded t-shirt, her eyes red-rimmed as if she had been crying. "I can't believe it's really over," she said as Daniel entered. "I know we only had a few days with it, but it feels like losing something important." "It was important," Daniel said. "It is important. That's why we're performing tonight, remember? To prove that these few days mattered, that the music we made together was real and valuable." Rebecca nodded, visibly pulling herself together. "You're right. No morning until after the performance." They spent the next 2 hours at the piano, playing everything they had learned over the past few days. They ran through the duet multiple times, polishing it until they could play it almost from memory. Then they each played solo pieces for each other, a final sharing of their individual musical voices before the piano disappeared. Daniel played a Bach prelude he had been working on for months. Rebecca played a Debussy piece from her childhood that she had recently relearned. The apartment filled with music, beautiful and bittersweet, every note weighted with the knowledge that these were their final moments with this instrument. At 1:45, they heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, purposeful footsteps accompanied by male voices discussing the logistics of moving a piano down 4 flights of stairs. The movers had arrived early. Daniel and Rebecca looked at each other across the piano, and without speaking, both placed their hands on the keys. Together, they played the opening phrase of their duet one final time. Just the first few measures, not the whole piece, but enough to honor what they had created together. Then Rebecca stood up and carefully replaced the white sheet over the piano, covering it like a shroud. There was a knock on the door, and Daniel answered it. 2 large men in work uniforms stood in the hallway with moving equipment. "We're here for the piano removal," one of them said, consulting a work order on his clipboard. "Come on in," Daniel said, stepping aside. The movers entered and assessed the piano, discussing angles and weight distribution. They removed the sheet Rebecca had just placed and began preparing the instrument for transport, wrapping it in protective blankets and attaching straps. The whole process took about 30 minutes. Daniel and Rebecca stood silently in the corner of the apartment, watching as the piano was tilted, lifted, and maneuvered toward the door. The movers were efficient and professional, treating the instrument with care as they navigated the tight hallway and began the careful descent down the stairs. Daniel and Rebecca followed at a distance, unable to look away as the piano made its slow journey toward the waiting truck. Other tenants emerged from their apartments to watch, creating a small procession of witnesses. Mrs. Chen stood in her doorway with her hand over her heart. Jake Sullivan gave Daniel a supportive nod as they passed his apartment. Even the Thompsons peered out, though they looked more annoyed than sad about the commotion. When the movers finally loaded the piano onto their truck and secured it for transport, Daniel felt something inside him crack. That piano had represented possibility, the dream of real musical expression that he had carried since childhood. Watching it drive away felt like watching his dreams disappear around the corner. Rebecca stood beside him on the sidewalk, tears streaming silently down her face. Daniel reached out and took her hand, squeezing gently. "It's not over," he said quietly. "We still have tonight. We still get to perform." Rebecca squeezed back. "You're right. Let's make it count." They stood there together until the moving truck disappeared from view, then slowly walked back into the building. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, empty hours to fill before the evening's open mic. Daniel returned to his apartment and tried to rest, but sleep was impossible. He kept running through the duet in his mind, hearing Rebecca's part interweaving with his own, feeling the weight of the piano keys that no longer existed in the building above him. At 5 o'clock, Daniel showered and changed into his best clothes. He didn't own much that was performance appropriate, but he found a button-down shirt that was relatively unwrinkled and a pair of dark jeans that looked presentable. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. His eyes held a mixture of excitement and terror that he had never seen in himself before. At 5:30, he climbed the stairs to collect Rebecca. She answered the door wearing a simple black dress that Daniel had never seen before, her hair styled and makeup carefully applied. She looked beautiful and terrified in equal measure. "Ready?" Daniel asked. "As I'll ever be," Rebecca replied. They left the building together and walked toward the downtown cafe where the open mic was held, neither of them speaking much, both lost in their own thoughts about what the evening would bring. The cafe was smaller than Daniel had imagined, tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat on a quiet street downtown. Warm light spilled from its windows onto the sidewalk, and through the glass, Daniel could see people already gathering inside. His heart hammered against his ribs as he and Rebecca approached the entrance. A handwritten sign taped to the door announced the open mic night with a cheerful invitation for anyone to share their talent. Inside, the cafe smelled of coffee and cinnamon. Small tables clustered around a makeshift stage area where a microphone stood next to an old upright piano. Daniel's breath caught when he saw the instrument. It looked nothing like the beautiful piano they had lost that afternoon, with scratched wood and chipped keys, but it was real and it was waiting. A young woman with purple hair and multiple piercings greeted them from behind the counter. "Here for the open mic?" she asked brightly. "First time," Rebecca said, her voice shaky. "Awesome," the woman replied. "Just add your names to the list over there. You'll probably go on around 7:30. There are a few people ahead of you." Daniel and Rebecca found seats near the back, both too nervous to speak much. They watched as other performers took the stage. A college student strummed acoustic guitar and sang an original song about heartbreak. An older man recited poetry about his childhood in Vietnam. A teenage girl played violin with impressive technical skill but little emotional depth. Each performance received warm applause from the small audience, maybe 30 people scattered throughout the cafe. Everyone seemed supportive and encouraging, which helped calm Daniel's racing pulse slightly. At 7:25, the woman with purple hair called their names. "Daniel and Rebecca, you're up next." They stood simultaneously, and Daniel felt Rebecca's hand slip into his. Her palm was sweaty, matching his own. They walked to the stage together, and Daniel sat on the right side of the piano bench while Rebecca took the left, just as they had practiced. The audience quieted, waiting. Daniel looked out at the faces watching them and saw mostly strangers, but in the back row, he spotted a familiar figure. Jake Sullivan had come to watch, giving them an encouraging thumbs up. Daniel and Rebecca exchanged a glance, and in her eyes, he saw his own fear reflected back. But he also saw determination and trust. They had prepared for this moment. They knew the music. They could do this together. Rebecca gave a small nod, and they placed their hands on the keys. The opening notes of the Irish melody filled the cafe, gentle and haunting. Daniel's fingers found their positions automatically, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought faltered. Beside him, Rebecca's bass line provided a solid foundation, steady and sure. Their parts began to interweave, creating the harmonic texture they had worked so hard to achieve. As they played, something extraordinary happened. The nervousness that had gripped Daniel moments before began to dissolve, replaced by the same feeling he had experienced in Rebecca's apartment. The outside world faded away. The audience disappeared. There was only the music and the connection between two people creating something beautiful together. They moved through the piece with growing confidence, their timing synchronized, their dynamics matching, their interpretation unified. When they reached the more intense middle section, Daniel felt the emotion of the past few days pour through his fingers. The loss of the piano, the pain Rebecca had shared, the dreams they both carried, all of it flowed into the music, giving it depth and authenticity. The final measures arrived too quickly, the melody resolving into peaceful conclusion. They played the last chord together and let it ring out until the sound faded into silence. For a moment, the cafe was completely still. Then the applause began, not polite and perfunctory like it had been for previous performers, but genuine and enthusiastic. People were on their feet. Jake was clapping and whistling. Even the barista had stopped making drinks to applaud. Daniel and Rebecca stood from the piano bench, holding hands and bowing awkwardly. They returned to their seats in a daze, barely processing the compliments people offered as they passed. After the open mic ended, Jake approached them with a huge grin. "That was incredible," he said. "You two play like you've been performing together for years." "Thanks for coming," Daniel said, still processing what had just happened. "Wouldn't have missed it," Jake replied. "Hey, I know someone who runs a community music program. They're always looking for volunteer teachers, people who can work with kids who can't afford formal lessons. I think you both should consider it." The suggestion caught Daniel off guard. Teaching had never occurred to him as a possibility. But why not? He had taught himself piano. He understood what it meant to love music without access to proper training or instruments. Rebecca seemed intrigued as well. "That might be something worth exploring," she said. As they left the cafe and walked back toward Riverside Apartments, Daniel felt different than he had that morning. Lighter somehow, despite losing the piano. Hopeful in a way he hadn't been in years. "We actually did it," Rebecca said, wonder in her voice. "We performed in front of people and they liked it." "We more than did it," Daniel replied. "We proved something. To ourselves, to everyone watching. That music isn't just for people who can afford conservatories and private lessons. It's for anyone willing to work for it." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the evening air cool against their flushed faces. When they reached the apartment building, Rebecca stopped before going inside. "What happens now?" she asked. "With us, I mean. Do we just go back to being regular neighbors who sometimes chat in the hallway?" Daniel considered the question. The piano that had brought them together was gone, but something else had been built in its place. A friendship, a partnership, maybe something more. "I don't think we can go back," he said honestly. "Not after everything we've shared. I don't want to go back anyway." "I don't either," Rebecca admitted. "So maybe we keep moving forward. We look into that community music program Jake mentioned. We find other places to play, other opportunities to make music together. We proved that losing one piano doesn't mean giving up on the dream. Rebecca smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile Daniel had seen from her. I'd like that. Over the following weeks, Daniel and Rebecca did exactly what they promised. They contacted the community music program and began volunteering as assistant teachers, helping children from low-income families discover the joy of making music. They found a church that allowed them to practice on their piano during off hours. They performed at 2 more open mics and started planning to audition for a local amateur orchestra. The transformation wasn't just musical. Rebecca began to heal from her divorce, finding new purpose and identity beyond her failed marriage. Daniel started taking online music theory courses, systematically filling in the gaps in his self-taught education. They pushed each other to improve, celebrated small victories together, and provided support during moments of doubt. The basement apartment and the bare 4th floor unit became places they visited less frequently, spending more time in practice rooms, cafes, and community centers where music happened. 3 months after the piano was removed from apartment 4B, Daniel knocked on Mr. Harrison's office door downtown. The landlord looked up from his desk with his usual scowl. "What is it, Park?" "I'm giving you my notice," Daniel said, placing an envelope on Harrison's desk. "I'm leaving at the end of the month." Harrison's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You're quitting? After 3 years?" "I got accepted into a certificate program for music education," Daniel explained. "It's not a full degree, but it's a start. I can't do it while working full-time here." Harrison stared at him for a moment, then shrugged. "Your choice. I'll find another superintendent." As Daniel left the office, he felt no regret. The job had served its purpose, giving him stability when he needed it. But he had outgrown the basement apartment and the life of fixing other people's problems while ignoring his own dreams. Rebecca left Riverside Apartments the same month, finding a better job in her field and moving to a nicer place across town. But distance didn't separate them. They met 3 times a week to practice, joined a piano duo competition, and continued teaching at the community center. The children they worked with reminded them why music mattered, watching young faces light up when they successfully played their first scale or completed their first simple piece. On the anniversary of the day Harrison had threatened to call the police, Daniel and Rebecca returned to that same cafe for open mic night. This time they played a more challenging piece, a Brahms duet they had spent months perfecting. The audience was larger now, some people having come specifically to hear them after word spread about the duo who played with such chemistry and passion. As they played, Daniel thought about the journey that had brought them here. A forgotten piano, a cruel landlord, 2 desperate people finding connection through shared love of music. What had seemed like an ending, the removal of that piano, had actually been a beginning. The real instrument they had discovered wasn't made of wood and strings. It was the partnership they had built, the courage they had found together, the determination to pursue beauty and meaning despite obstacles and opposition. The final chord rang out and the applause washed over them. Daniel looked at Rebecca and saw his own joy reflected in her expression. They had lost a piano but gained something far more valuable. They had found themselves and each other through music, and no landlord could ever take that away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.